I had not been at home above 10 days when Captain William Robinson, a Cornish man, commander of the Hopewell, came to my house, saying that he intended a voyage to the East Indies, and invited me to be surgeon of the ship. We set out on the 5th day of August, 1706, and arrived at Fort St. George the 11th of April, 1707. From thence we went to Tonkin and the neighbouring islands, but a great storm arising, we were driven to the north-north-east and boarded by pirates. It was determined by the pirate captain that I should be set adrift in a small canoe with paddles and a sail and 4 days' provisions. I sailed to an island which was all rocky. However, I got many birds' eggs and there roasted them. The next day I sailed to another island, and thence to a third and fourth, sometimes using my sail and sometimes my paddles. But not to trouble the reader with a particular account of my distresses, let it suffice that on the 5th day I arrived at the last island in my sight, which was also rocky, only a little intermingled with tufts of grass and sweet-smelling herbs. I lay all night in a cave where I had lodged my remaining provisions, and considered how impossible it was to preserve my life in so desolate a place, and how miserable my end must be. I slept very little, yet I found myself so listless and desponding that I had not the heart to rise until the day was far advanced. The sun was hot, and I walked a while among the rocks, until I perceived a vast opaque body between me and the sun, moving forwards towards the island. It seemed to be about 2 miles high, and hid the sun 6 or 7 minutes, but I did not observe the air to be much colder, or the sky more darkened, than if I had stood under the shade of a mountain. As it approached nearer over the place where I was, it appeared to be a firm substance, the bottom flat, smooth, and shining very bright from the reflection of the sea below. I took out my pocket telescope, and could plainly discover numbers of people moving up and down the sides of it. It advanced nearer, and I could see several gradations of galleries and stairs. I beheld some people fishing with long angling rods. I found, by their pointing, that they plainly discovered me, although they made no return to my shouting. The number of people increased, and in less than half an hour the island was moved and raised in such a manner that the lowest gallery appeared in a parallel of less than 100 yards distance from the height where I stood. I then put myself in the most supplicating postures, and spoke in the humblest accent, but received no answer. Those who stood nearest over against me seemed to be persons of distinction, as I supposed by their habit. They conferred earnestly with each other, looking often upon me. At length one of them called out in a clear, polite, smooth dialect, not unlike in sound to the Italian, and therefore I returned an answer in that language, hoping at least that the cadence might be more agreeable to his ears. Although neither of us understood the other, yet my meaning was easily known, for the people saw the distress I was in. They made signs for me to come down from the rock and go towards the shore, which I accordingly did, and the flying island, being raised to a convenient height, the verge directly over me, a chain was let down from the lowest gallery, with a seat fastened to the bottom, to which I fixed myself, and was drawn up by pulleys. At my alighting I was surrounded by a crowd of people, but those who stood nearest seemed to be of better quality. They beheld me with all the marks and circumstances of wonder. Neither indeed was I much in their debt, having never till then seen a race of mortals so singular in their shapes, habits, and countenances. Their heads were all reclined either to the right or the left, one of their eyes turned inward, and the other directly up to the zenith. Their outward garments were adorned with the figures of suns, moons, and stars, interwoven with those of fiddles, flutes, harps, trumpets, guitars, harpsichords, and many more instruments of music unknown to us in Europe. I observed here and there many in the habit of servants, with a blown bladder fastened like a flail to the end of a short stick, which they carried in their hands. In each bladder was a small quantity of dried peas, or little pebbles, as I was afterwards informed. With these bladders they now and then flapped the mouths and ears of those who stood near them. It seems that the minds of these people are so taken up with intense speculations that they neither can speak nor attend to the discourses of others without being roused by some external taction upon the organs of speech and hearing, for which reason those persons who are able to afford it always keep a flapper in their family as one of their domestics. And the business of this officer is, when 2 or more persons are in company, gently to strike with his bladder the mouth of him who is to speak, and the right ear of him or them to whom the speaker addresseth himself. It was necessary to give the reader this information, without which he would be at the same loss with me to understand the proceedings of these people, as they conducted me up the stairs to the top of the island, and from thence to the royal palace. While we were ascending, they forgot several times what they were about, and left me to myself, till their memories were again roused by their flappers. For they appeared altogether unmoved by the sight of my foreign habit and countenance, and by the shouts of the vulgar, whose thoughts and minds were more disengaged. At last we entered the palace, and proceeded into the chamber of presence, where I saw the king seated on his throne, attended on each side by persons of prime quality. Before the throne was a large table, filled with globes and spheres and mathematical instruments of all kinds. His Majesty took not the least notice of us, although our entrance were not without sufficient noise, by the concourse of all the persons belonging to the court. But he was then deep in a problem, and we attended at least an hour before he could solve it. While we were at dinner, I made bold to ask the names of several things in their language, and those noble persons, by the assistance of their flappers, delighted to give me answers, hoping to raise my admiration of their great abilities if I could be brought to converse with them. I was soon able to call for bread and drink, or whatever else I wanted. After dinner my company withdrew, and a person was sent to me by the king's order, attended by a flapper. He brought with him pen, ink, and paper, and 3 or 4 books, giving me to understand by signs that he was sent to teach me the language. We sat together 4 hours, in which time I wrote down a great number of words in columns, with the translations over against them. A tailor took my measure, and in 6 days brought my clothes, very ill-made and quite out of shape, by happening to mistake a figure in the calculation. But my comfort was that I observed such accidents very frequent and little regarded. Their ideas are perpetually conversant in lines and figures, or else by works of art drawn from music. I observed in the king's kitchen all sorts of mathematical and musical instruments, after the figures of which they cut up the joints served to his Majesty's table. Their houses are very ill built. They are very bad reasoners. They never enjoy a minute's peace of mind, dreading changes in the celestial bodies. For instance, that the earth, by the continual approaches of the sun towards it, must in course of time be absorbed or swallowed up. Thus they never sleep quietly in their beds. This flying or floating island is known as Laputa. The flying or floating island is exactly circular, its diameter 7,837 yards, or about 4 miles and a half, and consequently contains 10,000 acres. It is 300 yards thick. The bottom, or under surface, which appears to those who view it from below, is one even regular plate of adamant, shooting up to the height of about 200 yards. Above it lie the several minerals in their usual order, and over all is a coat of rich mould, 10 or 12 foot deep. The declivity of the upper surface, from the circumference to the centre, is the natural cause why all the dews and rains which fall upon the island are conveyed in small rivulets towards the middle, where they are emptied into 4 large basins, each of about half a mile in circuit and 200 yards distant from the centre. From these basins the water is continually exhaled by the sun in the daytime, which effectually prevents their overflowing. Besides, as it is in the power of the monarch to raise the island above the region of clouds and vapours, he can prevent the falling of dews and rains whenever he pleases. At the centre of the island there is a chasm about 50 yards in diameter, in which is to be found the greatest curiosity, upon which the fate of the island depends. A lodestone, of a prodigious size, in shape resembling a weaver's shuttle. It is in length 6 yards, and in the thickest part at least 3 yards over. This magnet is sustained by a very strong axle of adamant passing through its middle, upon which it plays, and is poised so exactly that the weakest hand can turn it. By means of this lodestone, the island is made to rise and fall and move from one place to another. For, with respect to that part of the earth over which the monarch presides, the stone is endued at one of its sides with an attractive power, and at the other with a repulsive. Upon placing the magnet erect, with its attracting end towards the earth, the island descends. But when the repelling extremity points downwards, the island mounts directly upwards. When the position of the stone is oblique, the motion of the island is so too. For in this magnet the forces always act in lines parallel to its direction. If any town should engage in rebellion or mutiny, fall into violent factions, or refuse to pay the usual tribute, the king hath 2 methods of reducing them to obedience. The first, and the mildest course, is by keeping the island hovering over such a town, and the lands about it, whereby he can deprive them of the benefit of the sun and the rain, and consequently afflict the inhabitants with dearth and diseases. And if the crime deserve it, they are at the same time pelted from above with great stones, against which they have no defence but by creeping into cellars or caves, while the roofs of their houses are beaten to pieces. But if they still continue obstinate, or offer to raise insurrections, he proceeds to the last remedy, by letting the island drop directly upon their heads, which makes a universal destruction both of houses and men. However, this is an extremity to which the prince is seldom driven. Although I cannot say that I was ill-treated in this island, yet I must confess I thought myself too much neglected, not without some degree of contempt. For neither prince nor people appeared to be curious in any part of knowledge except mathematics and music, wherein I was far their inferior, and upon that account very little regarded. On the other side, after having seen all the curiosities of the island, I was very desirous to leave it, being heartily weary of those people. They were indeed excellent in 2 sciences for which I have great esteem, and wherein I am not unversed, but at the same time so abstracted and involved in speculation that I never met with such disagreeable companions. I conversed only with women, tradesmen, flappers, and court pages during 2 months of my abode there, by which at last I rendered myself extremely contemptible, yet these were the only people from whom I could ever receive a reasonable answer. I had obtained a good degree of knowledge in their language, but I was weary of being confined to the island, and resolved to leave it with the first opportunity. There was a great lord of court, who was pleased to show me many marks of favour. He desired to be informed in the affairs of Europe, and listened to me with great attention. I entreated this illustrious person to intercede in my behalf with his Majesty for leave to depart, which he accordingly did. On the 16th day of February I took leave of his Majesty and the court. The king made me a present to the value of about £200 English, and my protector, his kinsman, as much more, together with a letter of recommendation to a friend of his in Luggnagg, the metropolis. The island being then hovering over a mountain about 2 miles from it, I was let down from the lowest gallery in the same manner as I had been taken up. The continent, as far as it is subject to the monarch of the flying island, passeth under the general name of Balnibarbi, and the metropolis, as I said before, is called Luggnagg. I felt some little satisfaction in finding myself on firm ground. I soon found out the person's house to whom I was recommended, presented my letter from his friend the grandee in the island, and was received with much kindness. This great lord, whose name was Munodi, ordered me an apartment in his own house, where I continued during my stay, and was entertained in a most hospitable manner. This Lord Munodi was a person of the first rank, and had been some years governor of Luggnagg, but by a cabal of ministers was discharged for insufficiency. The next morning after my arrival he took me in his chariot to see the town, which is about half the bigness of London, but the houses very strangely built, and most of them out of repair. The people in the streets walked fast, looked wild, their eyes fixed, and were generally in rags. I never knew a soil so unhappily cultivated, houses so ill-contrived and so ruinous, or a people whose countenances and habit expressed so much misery and want. When I gave free censure of the country and its inhabitants, Lord Munodi told me that about 40 years ago certain persons went up to Laputa, and after 5 months' continuance came back with a very little smattering in mathematics, but full of volatile spirits acquired in that airy region. That these persons, upon their return, began to dislike the management of everything below, and fell into schemes of putting all arts, sciences, languages, and mechanics upon a new foot. To this end, they procured a royal patent for erecting an academy of projectors in Luggnagg, and the humour prevailed so strongly among the people that there is not a town of any consequence in the kingdom without such an academy. In these colleges, the professors contrive new rules and methods of agriculture and building, and new instruments and tools for all trades and manufactures, whereby, as they undertake, one man shall do the work of 10. A palace may be built in a week, of materials so durable as to last forever without repairing. All the fruits of the earth shall come to maturity at whatever season we think fit to choose, and increase 100-fold more than they do at present, with innumerable other happy proposals. The only inconvenience is that none of these projects are yet brought to perfection, and in the meantime the whole country lies miserably waste, the houses in ruins, and the people without food or clothes. We drove into the country, and during our journey he made me observe the several methods used by farmers in managing their lands, which to me were wholly unaccountable, for except in some very few places I could not discover one ear of corn or blade of grass. His lordship said I should certainly view the academy. In a few days we came back to town, and His Excellency, considering the bad character he had in the academy, would not go with me himself, but recommended me to a friend of his to bear me company thither. My lord was pleased to represent me as a great admirer of projects, and a person of much curiosity and easy belief, which indeed was not without truth, for I had myself been a sort of projector in my younger days. The Grand Academy of Luggnagg is not a single building, but a continuation of several houses on both sides of a street. I was received very kindly by the warden, and went for many days to the academy. Every room hath in it one or more projectors, and I believe I could not be in fewer than 500 rooms. The first man I saw was of a meagre aspect, with sooty hands and face, his hair and beard long, ragged, and singed in several places. His clothes, shirt, and skin were all of the same colour. He had been 8 years upon a project for extracting sunbeams out of cucumbers, which were to be put into vials, hermetically sealed, and let out to warm the air in raw, inclement summers. He told me he did not doubt in 8 years more that he should be able to supply the governor's gardens with sunshine at a reasonable rate. But he complained that his stock was low, and entreated me to give him something as an encouragement to ingenuity, especially since this had been a very dear season for cucumbers. I made him a small present, for my lord had furnished me with money on purpose, because he knew their practice of begging from all who go to see them. I saw another at work to calcine ice into gunpowder, who likewise showed me a treatise he had written concerning the malleability of fire, which he intended to publish. There was a most ingenious architect who had contrived a new method for building houses, by beginning at the roof and working downwards to the foundation, which he justified to me by the like practice of those two prudent insects, the bee and the spider. There was a man born blind, who had several apprentices in his own condition. Their employment was to mix colours for painters, which their master taught them to distinguish by feeling and smelling. It was indeed my misfortune to find them at that time not very perfect in their lessons, and the professor himself happened to be generally mistaken. This artist is much encouraged and esteemed by the whole fraternity. In another apartment I was highly pleased with a projector who had found a device of ploughing the ground with hogs to save the charges of ploughs, cattle, and labour. The method is this. In an acre of ground you bury, at 6 inches distance and 8 deep, a quantity of acorns, dates, chestnuts, whereof these animals are fondest. Then you drive 600 or more of them into the field, where in a few days they will root up the whole ground in search of their food, and make it fit for sowing, at the same time manuring it with their dung. It is true, upon experiment they found the charge and trouble very great, and they had little or no crop. However, it is not doubted that this invention may be capable of great improvement. I shall not trouble my reader with all the curiosities I observed. The great physician, famous for curing colic by an operation, I saw him experiment on a dog, which died on the spot. We crossed a walk to the other part of the academy, where the projectors in speculative learning resided. The first professor had 40 pupils about him, and showed me a large wooden frame, composed of several bits of wood, about the bigness of a die, covered on every square with the words of the language, but without any order. Iron handles turned the frame, and the whole disposition of words was entirely changed. He then commanded 36 of the lads to read the several lines softly as they appeared upon the frame, and where they found 3 or 4 words together that might make part of a sentence, they dictated to the 4 remaining boys, who were scribes. This work was repeated 3 or 4 times, and at every turn the engine was so contrived that the words shifted into new places, as the square bits of wood moved upside down. 6 hours a day the young students were employed in this labour, and the professor showed me several volumes in large folio already collected of broken sentences which he intended to piece together, and out of those rich materials to give the world a complete body of all arts and sciences, which, however, might be still improved and much expedited if the public would raise a fund for making and employing 500 such frames in legado, and oblige the managers to contribute in common their several collections. We next went to the School of Languages, where 3 professors sat in consultation upon improving that of their own country. The first project was to shorten discourse by cutting polysyllables into one, and leaving out verbs and participles, because, in reality, all things imaginable are but nouns. The other project was a scheme for entirely abolishing all words whatsoever, and this was urged as a great advantage in point of health as well as brevity. For it is plain that every word we speak is in some degree a diminution of our lungs by corrosion, and consequently contributes to the shortening of our lives. An expedient was therefore offered that, since words are only names for things, it would be more convenient for all men to carry about them such things as were necessary to express the particular business they are to discourse on. Another professor showed me a large treatise for discovering plots and conspiracies by examining the diet of all suspected persons. The whole discourse was written with great acuteness, containing many observations both curious and useful for politicians, but, as I conceived, not altogether complete. This I ventured to tell the author, and offered, if he pleased, to supply him with some additions. He received my proposition gladly, and I told him that in the kingdom of Tribnia, by the natives called Langdon, where I had long sojourned, the bulk of the people consisted wholly of discoverers, witnesses, informers, accusers, prosecutors, evidences, swearers, together with their several subservient and subaltern instruments, all under the colours, the conduct, and pay of ministers and their deputies. The plots in that kingdom are usually the workmanship of those persons who desire to stifle discontent, to restore new vigour, to fill their coffers, as either shall best answer their private advantage. It is first agreed and settled among them what suspected persons shall be accused of a plot. Then effectual care is taken to secure all their letters and other papers, and put the owners in chains. These papers are delivered to a set of artists very dexterous in finding out the mysterious meanings of words, syllables, and letters. For instance, they can decipher a close stool to signify a privy council, a flock of geese, a senate, a lame dog, an invader, a cod's head, the plague, a standing army, a buzzard, a prime minister, the gout, a high priest, a gibbet, a secretary of state, a chamber pot, a committee of grandees, a sieve, a court lady, a broom, a revolution, a mousetrap, an employment, a bottomless pit, the treasury, a sink, the court, a cap and bells, a favourite, a broken reed, a court of justice, an empty tun, a general, a running saw, the administration. When this method fails, they have two others more effectual, which the learned among them call acrostics and anagrams. First, they can decipher all initial letters into political meanings. Thus, N shall signify a plot, B, a regiment of horse, L, a fleet at sea. Or secondly, by transposing the letters of the alphabet in any suspected paper, they can lay open the deepest designs of a discontented party. So, for example, if I should say in a letter to a friend, "Our brother Tom has just got the piles," a man of skill in this art would discover how the same letters which compose that sentence may be analysed into the following words: resist, a plot is brought home, the tour. And this is the anagrammatic method. The professor made me great acknowledgments for communicating these observations, and promised to make honourable mention of me in his treatise. I saw nothing in this country that could invite me to a longer continuance, and began to think of returning home to England. While I was yet in the kingdom of Balnibarbi, I made several visits to the Academy of Luggnagg, but I shall not trouble my reader with all the curiosities I observed, being studious of brevity. But I must mention one illustrious person more, who is called among them the universal artist. He told us he had been 30 years employing his thoughts for the improvement of human life. He had 2 large rooms full of wonderful curiosities, and 50 men at work. Some were condensing air into a dry, tangible substance by extracting the nitre, and letting the aqueous or fluid particles percolate. Others softening marble for pillows and pincushions. Others petrifying the hoofs of a living horse to preserve them from foundering. The artist himself was at that time busy upon 2 great designs. The first, to sow land with chaff, wherein he affirmed the true seminal virtue to be contained, as he demonstrated by several experiments which I was not skilful enough to comprehend. The other was, by a certain composition of gums, minerals, and vegetables outwardly applied, to prevent the growth of wool upon 2 young lambs, and he hoped, in a reasonable time, to propagate the breed of naked sheep all over the kingdom. I was at the mathematical school, where the master taught his pupils after a method scarce imaginable to us in Europe. The proposition and demonstration were fairly written on a thin wafer with ink composed of a cephalic tincture. This the student was to swallow upon a fasting stomach, and for 3 days following eat nothing but bread and water. As the wafer digested, the tincture mounted to his brain, bearing the proposition along with it. But the success hath not hitherto been answerable, partly by some error in the quantum, or composition, and partly by the perverseness of lads, to whom this bolus is so nauseous that they generally steal aside and discharge it upwards before it can operate. Neither have they been yet persuaded to use so long an abstinence as the prescription requires. Again, because it is a general complaint that the favourites of princes are troubled with short and weak memories, the doctors proposed that whoever attended a first minister, after having told his business with the utmost brevity and in the plainest words, should, at his departure, give the said minister a tweak by the nose, or a kick in the belly, or tread on his corns, or lug him thrice by both ears, or run a pin into his breech, or pinch his arm black and blue, to prevent forgetfulness, and at every levee day repeat the same operation, till the business were done, or absolutely refused. But enough of such curiosities. The continent of which this kingdom is a part extends itself, as I have reason to believe, eastward to that unknown tract of America westward of California, and north to the Pacific Ocean, which is not above 150 miles from Luggnagg, where there is a good port and much commerce with the great island of Luggnagg, situated to the northwest, about 29 degrees north latitude and 140 longitude. This island of Luggnagg stands southeastwards of Japan, about 100 leagues distant. There is a strict alliance between the Japanese emperor and the king of Luggnagg, which affords frequent opportunities of sailing from one island to the other. I determined, therefore, to direct my course this way, in order to effect my return to Europe. I hired 2 mules with a guide to show me the way and carry my small baggage. I took leave of my noble protector, who had shown me so much favour and made me a generous present at my departure. My journey was without any accident or adventure worth relating. When I arrived at the port of Maldonada, for so it is called, there was no ship in the harbour bound for Luggnagg, nor like to be in some time. The town is about as large as Portsmouth. I soon fell into some acquaintance, and was very hospitably received. A gentleman of distinction said to me that since the ships bound for Luggnagg could not be ready in less than a month, it might be no disagreeable amusement for me to take a trip to the little island of Glubbdubdrib, about 5 leagues off to the southwest. He offered himself and a friend to accompany me, and that I should be provided with a small convenient bark for the voyage. Glubbdubdrib, as nearly as I can interpret the word, signifies the island of sorcerers or magicians. It is about 1/3 as large as the Isle of Wight, and extremely fruitful. It is governed by the head of a certain tribe, who are all magicians. This tribe marries only among each other, and the eldest in succession is prince or governor. He hath a noble palace, and a park of about 3,000 acres, surrounded by a wall of hewn stone 20 foot high. In this park are several smaller enclosures for cattle, corn, and gardening. The governor and his family are served and attended by domestics of a kind somewhat unusual. By his skill in necromancy, he hath power of calling whom he pleaseth from the dead, and commanding their service for 24 hours, but no longer. Nor can he call the same persons up again in less than 3 months, except upon very extraordinary occasions. I had the honour to dine with the governor, where a set of ghosts served up the meat and waited at table. Having a desire to see those ancients who were most renowned for wit and learning, I set apart one day on purpose. His Highness the Governor ordered me to call up whatever persons I would choose to name, and in whatever numbers, among all the dead from the beginning of the world to the present time. I made my humble acknowledgments to His Highness for so great a favour. I desired to see Alexander the Great, who was called up into the room. It was with great difficulty that I understood his Greek, and had but little of his own. He assured me, upon his honour, that he was not poisoned, but died of a fever by excessive drinking. Next I saw Hannibal passing the Alps, who told me he had not a drop of vinegar in his camp. Caesar and Pompey and Brutus came towards us, and vast numbers of illustrious persons were called up. Homer and Aristotle appeared, and Descartes. I then spent some days in seeing some of the modern dead, and after having strictly examined all the persons of greatest name in the courts of princes for 100 years past, I found how the world had been misled by prostitute writers to ascribe the greatest exploits in war to cowards, the wisest counsel to fools, sincerity to flatterers, Roman virtue to betrayers of their country, piety to atheists, chastity to sodomites, truth to informers. How many innocent and excellent persons had been condemned to death or banishment by the practising of great ministers upon the corruption of judges and the malice of factions? How many villains had been exalted to the highest places of trust, power, dignity, and profit? How great a share in the motions and events of courts, councils, and senates might be challenged by bawds, whores, pimps, parasites, and buffoons. How low an opinion I had of human wisdom and integrity, when I was truly informed of the springs and motives of great enterprises and revolutions in the world, and of the contemptible accidents to which they owed their success. The day of our departure being come, I took leave of His Highness the Governor of Glubbdubdrib, and returned with my 2 companions to Maldonado, where, after a fortnight's waiting, a ship was ready to sail for Luggnagg. We had one violent storm, and arrived there on the 21st of April, 1709. The King was much delighted with my company, and ordered his Bliffmar Club, or High Chamberlain, to appoint a lodging in the court for me and my interpreter, with a daily allowance for my table, and a large purse of gold for my common expenses. I stayed 3 months in this country, out of perfect obedience to His Majesty, who was pleased highly to favour me, and made me very honourable offers. But I thought it more consistent with prudence and justice to pass the remainder of my days with my wife and family. The Lugnaggians are a polite and generous people, and although they are not without some share of that pride which is peculiar to all eastern countries, yet they show themselves courteous to strangers, especially such who are countenanced by the court. I had many acquaintance among persons of the best fashion, and being always attended by my interpreter, the conversation we had was not disagreeable. One day, in much good company, I was asked by a person of quality whether I had seen any of their struldbrugs, or immortals. I said I had not, and desired he would explain to me what he meant by such an appellation applied to a mortal creature. He told me that sometimes, though very rarely, a child happened to be born in a family with a red circular spot in the forehead, directly over the left eyebrow, which was an infallible mark that it should never die. I cried out as in a rapture, "Happy nation, where every child hath at least a chance of being immortal! Happy people, who enjoy so many living examples of ancient virtue, and have masters ready to instruct them in the wisdom of all former ages! But happiest beyond all comparison are those excellent struldbrugs." They were desirous to know in a particular manner what scheme of living I should have formed to myself, if it had fallen to my lot to have been born a struldbrug. I answered that, if it had been my good fortune to come into the world a struldbrug, as soon as I could discover my own happiness by understanding the difference between life and death, I would first resolve, by all arts and methods whatsoever, to procure myself riches, in the pursuit of which, by thrift and management, I might reasonably expect, in about 200 years, to be the wealthiest man in the kingdom. In the second place, I would, from my earliest youth, apply myself to the study of arts and sciences, by which I should arrive in time to excel all others in learning. Lastly, I would carefully record every action and event of consequence that happened in the public, impartially draw the characters of the several successions of princes and great ministers of state, with my own observations on every point. I would exactly set down the several changes in customs, language, fashions of dress, diet, and diversions. By all which acquirements I should be a living treasury of knowledge and wisdom, and certainly become the oracle of the nation. Add to all this the pleasure of seeing the various revolutions of states and empires, the changes in the world, ancient cities in ruins, and obscure villages become the seats of kings. I should then see the discovery of the longitude, the perpetual motion, the universal medicine, and many other great inventions brought to the utmost perfection. What wonderful discoveries should we make in astronomy by outliving and confirming our own predictions, by observing the progress and returns of comets, with the changes of motion in the sun, moon, and stars. At last the same gentleman who had been my interpreter said he was desired by the rest to set me right in a few mistakes, which I had fallen into through the common imbecility of human nature, and upon that allowance was less answerable for them. That the system of living contrived by me was unreasonable and unjust, because it supposed a perpetuity of youth, health, and vigour, which no man could be so foolish to hope, however extravagant he might be in his wishes. That the question, therefore, was not whether a man would choose to be always in the prime of youth, attended with prosperity and health, but how he would pass a perpetual life under all the usual disadvantages which old age brings along with it. For although few men will avow their desires of being immortal upon such hard conditions, yet he observed that every man desired to put off death for some time longer, let it approach ever so late, and he rarely heard of any man who died willingly, except he were incited by the extremity of grief or torture. After this preface, he gave me a particular account of the Struldbrugs among them. He said they commonly acted like mortals till about 30 years old, after which, by degrees, they grew melancholy and dejected. When they came to 80 years, which is reckoned the extremity of living in this country, they had not only all the follies and infirmities of other old men, but many more which arose from the dreadful prospect of never dying. They were not only opinionative, peevish, covetous, morose, vain, talkative, but incapable of friendship, and dead to all natural affection, which never descended below their grandchildren. Envy and impotent desires are their prevailing passions. They have no remembrance of anything but what they learned and observed in their youth and middle age, and even that is very imperfect. They are despised and hated by all sorts of people. As soon as they have completed the term of 80 years, they are looked on as dead in law. Their heirs immediately succeed to their estates, only a small pittance is reserved to their support, and the poor ones are maintained at the public charge. At 90, they lose their teeth and hair. They have at that age no distinction of taste, but eat and drink whatever they can get without relish or appetite. The diseases they were subject to still continue without increasing or diminishing. In talking, they forget the common appellation of things, and the names of persons, even of those who are their nearest friends and relations. This was the account given me of the Struldbrugs, as near as I can remember. I afterwards saw 5 or 6 of different ages, the youngest not above 200 years old. They were the most mortifying sight I ever beheld, and the women more horrible than the men. The reader will easily believe that from what I had heard and seen, my keen appetite for perpetuity of life was much abated. I grew heartily ashamed of the pleasing visions I had formed, and thought no tyrant could invent a death into which I would not run with pleasure from such a life. The king wished I would send a couple of Struldbrugs to my own country to arm our people against the fear of death, but this, it seems, is forbidden by the fundamental laws of the kingdom, or else I should have been well content with the trouble and expense of transporting them. His Majesty having often pressed me to accept some employment in his court, and finding me absolutely determined to return to my native country, was pleased to give me his license to depart, and honoured me with a letter of recommendation under his own hand to the Emperor of Japan. He likewise presented me with 444 large pieces of gold, this nation delighting in even numbers, and a red diamond, which I sold in England for £1,100. On the 6th day of May, 1709, I took a solemn leave of His Majesty and all my friends. This prince was so gracious as to order a guard to conduct me to Glangwenstald, which is a royal port to the southwest of the island. In 6 days I found a vessel ready to carry me to Japan. There I did petition that His Majesty would condescend to excuse my performing the ceremony of trampling upon the crucifix. The Emperor seemed a little surprised, and rather suspected I must be a Christian, but said he would comply with the singularity of my humour. On the 9th day of June, 1709, I arrived at Nangasak, and fell into the company of some Dutch sailors belonging to the Amboina of Amsterdam. I spoke Dutch well, having pursued my studies at Leiden, and the captain, understanding I was a surgeon, was contented to take half the usual rate for my voyage to Holland. Nothing happened worth mentioning in this voyage. We sailed with a fair wind to the Cape of Good Hope, where we stayed only to take in fresh water. On the 16th of April we arrived safe at Amsterdam, having lost only 3 men by sickness in the voyage, and a 4th who fell from the foremast into the sea, not far from the coast of Guinea. From Amsterdam I soon after set sail for England in a small vessel belonging to that city. On the 20th of April, 1710, we put in at the Downs. I landed the next morning, and saw once more my native country after an absence of 5 years and 6 months complete. I went straight to Redriff, where I arrived the same day at 2 in the afternoon, and found my wife and family in good health.